Hello Blazers, welcome to episode 150 of UAB Green and Told, original release Monday, May 19th, 2025. This podcast gives us a chance to share stories from members of the UAB community. Looking for past episodes? Find UAB's most listened to podcast at alumni.uab.edu/greenandtold on Spotify or the Apple Podcast app. And while you're there, leave a written review so more alums can listen in. I'm Greg Berry, a UAB alum and Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Today's podcast guest's interest with federal law enforcement began at a young age. Ryan Schwoebel was fascinated by the stories and experiences shared by his grandfather. The excitement and sense of duty associated with the job captivated him.
He came home from work in this big black SUV, and without telling us it was him, he hit the lights and sirens, spooked us, and then got out of the car, and I just thought it was the coolest thing.
While working as a Tuscaloosa police officer, Ryan's career took a turn, leading him to a job with NCIS. Yes, that NCIS.
If you'd asked me when I took that job, what was my dream job, that was it. It absolutely was.
However, as we'll learn, his job came with personal sacrifices, including one that would see his career shift again.
When I would pick him up to hold him, he would start crying, and it kind of broke my heart. I realized I was at a crossroads where I had to either continue to pursue my career with NCIS and kind of put family second, or make a career change. My mom will tell you that, like, from a very young age, riding my tricycle, that I had toy police badges and stuff like that. So I guess I knew from an early age that was something that was interested to me, was a law enforcement career. And then I kind of phased out of that for a long time, and then found myself in college, studying psychology, really not sure what I wanted to do other than hang around the fraternity house. So then 9/11 happened, and 9/11 happened, I think it was my sophomore year, and that kind of shook in me a drive to do something. And immediately I thought about dropping out of college and joining the Marine Corps. And my grandfather, who retired as a command sergeant major in the Army, and then went on to a second career with the Secret Service, he basically said in his own way, "Ryan, if you do that, I'm going to come down to Alabama and I'm going to beat your butts." But he said a little bit more direct than that. And he also made the point, he said, if you're going to go into the military, finish your college degree and then pursue going in as an officer. I tried that. I applied through OCS with the Coast Guard because of their mission with Homeland Security, looked at Army OCS as well. And never really gained the traction that I was looking for in either of those directions. And so then I kind of decided, why don't I go full steam ahead with this idea of getting a master's degree and pursuing federal law enforcement, which is ultimately the path that I went.
What was it about the federal law enforcement that kind of made you go that track? Because obviously law enforcement was kind of in the cards based off of the trike and having the badges and all that and the stars on those decked out when you were a kid. But why federal?
You mentioned that my grandfather was Secret Service. I always looked up to him as kind of my hero. I can remember as a boy visiting his house up in Northern Virginia. I forget exactly how old I was. I was probably 9 or 10, something like that. And my brother and I were playing in the front yard of his house. Grandma was inside and he was at work, and he came home from work in this big black SUV. And without telling us it was him, he hit the lights and sirens, spooked us, and then got out of the car. And I just thought it was the coolest thing. That was a big motivator for me. The fact that my grandfather had worked in federal law enforcement for a career. And then also just, with the desire to go into that field, having been from 9/11, I wanted to do something that was in the vein of, working to prevent the next 9/11. So I wanted to go federal because of, the national security implications and, the opportunities to do not only criminal investigations, but intelligence, counterintelligence work. And so that's really what kind of drafted my career path in pursuit into going federal, was that mixture of my grandfather's background in federal law enforcement and that desire to kind of the motivation from 9/11.
After you graduated from Montevallo, you chose to come to Birmingham. Was that just out of because you were close to Birmingham? This is where home was.
That was a factor, but a bigger factor for me was, I was pursuing a master's degree in criminal justice, and I got accepted to two places that I applied, the University of Alabama and UAB. It's a little bit different now, but at that time in the early 2000s, if I wanted to do an internship with a federal agency, which I thought would, set me up better for eventual employment after I graduated, the federal agencies were more plentiful in the Birmingham area than they were in the Tuscaloosa area. That's changed to a good degree in the 20 years since then. But back then, I thought I had a better opportunity to not only get a degree, but do internships that could materialize into an actual job after graduation if I went to UAB. And ultimately, that ended up working out pretty well.
What was the master's program for the criminal justice like when you were at UAB?
When I was here at UAB as a graduate student, which again was 2003 and 2004, it was a mixture of those of us who had just or recently graduated from undergraduate and were pursuing, the next phase of our education, as well as working professionals who, had been working in, the field of criminal justice in whatever, capacity that was, and were pursuing advanced education. That was helpful as it turned out. I didn't know it going in, but that ended up being really helpful for me because two of the classmates that I had while I was a graduate student at UAB in criminal justice were special agents with Air Force Office of Special Investigations, OSI. And I got to talking with them and realized that Air Force OSI was federal law enforcement. It was, through the Department of the Air Force, which is under the Department of Defense. Mm-hmm. And their workforce of special agents is a mixture of active duty service members and civilian special agents. They have special agents that they have the same credentials, but some are active duty, some are either active duty or reserve, and then some are straight civilian. I thought that was really interesting because as I got to talking with them, I realized that they had investigations and operations that were national security and intelligence, counterintelligence related, but then they also worked felony investigations of crimes that happen on base or with an Air Force nexus. And I found that interesting because they got involved in homicides, they got involved in drug investigations, they got involved in sex offenses. So they worked a lot of crime similar to like a local police detective, but at the pay and benefits of a federal agent. And that really appealed to me. So I applied for Air Force OSI. I made it to a panel interview out in San Antonio, Texas. But ultimately, I didn't get a job offer from that opportunity. And so I started doing some further research because I was like, well, if the Air Force has an opportunity like this, maybe the other branches of the military do too. And at that time, again, it was a little bit different world. Army was pretty much exclusively active duty service members that served as special agents in their Criminal Investigation Command or CID. Okay. And then Navy was kind of the opposite. Navy had NCIS, which was almost entirely civilian. The different branches kind of played it a little bit differently. At that time, I was vaguely familiar with the NCIS TV show, but I never watched it. As I applied for NCIS, that ended up being a question I was asked during the interviews is how much of the TV show have you watched? And when I answered none, they said, that's great because we don't have to educate you of what the TV show depicts from real life. So ultimately, that's the career path that I pursued. It took quite a while from the time I graduated to the time I actually got a job offer from NCIS. It's about 3.5 years. So during that time, I was able to start my law enforcement career. I was working for a private company, but I was working part-time also with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office as a reserve deputy sheriff. I did that for a couple of years. And I realized at that time I was more interested in working in law enforcement, whatever capacity that was, than working a full-time job in an office. And so I made a career transition to going full-time into law enforcement with the Tuscaloosa Police Department. And enjoyed it there, was there for just under a year and had plans to stay longer. But I literally, after getting through police academy and getting out into patrol, I was running radar on the side of the road one day, and I got a phone call from Washington, D.C., and it was NCIS making me a job offer for a job I had applied to about 3.5 years earlier.
Wow.
So it took a while to get through that process, but ultimately, I was a newly engaged man, about to have my wedding to my now bride, and had this, crazy offer of, hey, you can come be a federal agent, but you've got to pack up everything you've got. You've got to go into training for 6 months immediately following your wedding and have your wife relocate you to another state and start a life far away from family. And ultimately, that's what we did.
Had you kind of forgotten about that interview 3.5 years prior to that? Because that's a long period of time.
I hadn't forgotten about it because it wasn't the interview and then nothing else. There were little pieces of the application process over the course of those 3.5 years. Going in for drug screening, going in for psychological evaluation, going in for a written examination, the background investigation, which is extremely extensive. I mean, they go and talk to former teachers and professors that you had in college, neighbors. Funny story. One of them went to interview a lady that was a former boss for a little part-time job that I had when I was in college, and she was a family friend. And so she was coming home from work and having gotten groceries, and she's carrying bags of groceries into her house, and this agent comes out, steps out of a Crown Victoria, all black, approaches her, shows his badge, explains who he is. She drops her groceries and is like, oh my God, what has my son done? Her son was in college at Alabama, and she thought he had gotten into trouble. And he's like, oh, no, ma'am, I'm here about Ryan Schwoebel. We're doing a background investigation. So she called my parents and was like, could have used a little forewarning there, but ultimately she gave a good word about me. And, I had always heard when it comes to applying for federal jobs, especially federal law enforcement jobs, no news is good news. When you don't hear anything, that means things are inching their way along. It's when you get the letter in the mail that says thanks, but no thanks, that, you're out of the applicant pool. So when things went quiet, I just went about, doing the job that I was doing at that time and thinking that may be my long-term path. And then, 3.5 years later, got that offer.
You were up there in Norfolk 4 or 5 years working as a special agent for NCIS. What was it like? Because at this point, it was kind of the dream gig.
Yeah, it was, if you'd asked me when I took that job, what was my dream job, that was it.
Yeah.
It absolutely was. And then, it's funny, you get about 2 years into a job like that, the rose-colored glasses come off. And it's not that it was a bad job. A lot more paperwork than you see on TV. Overall, great coworkers that I worked with, but there's like any job, there's monotony. There's the clerical data entry parts of the job that can be monotonous, and the actual opportunity to do the quote unquote fun stuff, serve and search warrants, stuff like that. They occur, but they're not every day. And when they occur, there's a boatload of paperwork that follows them. So you got to document everything for it to be ready for prosecution in court and things like that. I enjoyed it, but ultimately, I did what was called a special agent afloat tour, and what that is where an NCIS special agent is assigned either to an aircraft carrier and its squadron, or to an amphibious squadron, which is deploying Marines when they, go overseas to deploy. Your job when you're doing a special agent afloat is you're kind of like the floating sheriff of that squadron. Whether that's aircraft carrier or amphibious. And so when felony crimes come up, you investigate those, but then also there's a counterintelligence component to that job as well, because that squadron of ships is going oftentimes into waters and even, docking in ports that may be adversarial to the United States or outright hostile, with terrorist threats and things like that. So you're working with local law enforcement, local military, and host nation security services, trying to get information to be able to share back with the ships, the squadrons, the leadership, so that they can, be aware of what's going on. And that was an interesting mission. It was more counterintelligence focused than anything I had done before. But ultimately, when I came back, my son was 1 year old at that time. And when I would pick him up to hold him, he would start crying, and it kind of broke my heart. I realized I was at a crossroads where I had to either continue to pursue my career with NCIS and kind of put family second, or make a career change and look for opportunities that got my wife and I and our young son back closer to family, which were all in the Birmingham, Alabama area. And with NCIS, there was zero opportunity to get anywhere close to Birmingham, Alabama. I could get potentially within several hours, but that was not a guarantee. And so I looked at other federal law enforcement opportunities, Secret Service, didn't really look at FBI. My grandfather kind of poisoned me against FBI because he was Secret Service and they have a pretty sharp rivalry. So never really pursued FBI, but what's now called HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. And what I found was, even though I had years as a special agent, there wasn't, for my position, a lateral opportunity to be able to move closer to home. And so I could apply for entry-level positions, but the problem there would be, even though I may not lose pay, I would be going further away from home. I'd be going to New York City, Washington, D.C., Miami, Los Angeles, nowhere that would be getting me closer to home. So that's when I realized that, I probably needed to look at opportunities in the private sector where I could transition my skill set and have a little bit more control in terms of where I look for opportunities to be able to get closer to home.
You made your transition back to Birmingham and doing different things. And I believe the first was a security consultant for MaidPro for a few years, and then Region. So you started to use your criminal justice background in new ways, but similar.
So MaidPro of Birmingham, that's my in-laws' business. They had an opportunity where they do residential cleanings, they do commercial cleanings, and they were having some inventory, some equipment, things like that were turning up missing, turning up potentially stolen. And so they needed to develop, a very basic loss prevention, asset protection program for, they're not a retail store, but that same concept of, we need to know what we have, we need to have it inventoried, we need to be able to identify if there's a security issue that's happened. And then, if it's serious enough, we want someone to be able to handle coordinating that with law enforcement and seeking restitution for us, because, we're bleeding out all this money with vacuums and things like that keep turning up missing. And we know it's not just, falling off the face of the earth, but we don't have the time and resources without dedicating a position to do that. So that was a position that I did for about 2 years. And it was with the understanding, because it was, my in-laws' business, that I'd come in, stand that up, train someone up to be able to continue to do that going forward. But ultimately, I would be looking for a long-term career transition into the private sector. And so while I was doing that, I was also teaching at a different school, a college that's actually no longer around, called ITT Tech. And they had a criminal justice program. And while I was teaching there, met two other instructors who worked full-time for Regions Bank in their corporate security department. I had applied for a position as an investigator with Regions Bank back when I was in Virginia with NCIS, and I never heard anything. So getting to know these two guys really well, one of them said, look, if you're applying for a position with our bank and you're not getting any traction, send me your resume and I'll shoot it over to the hiring manager, and maybe we can, see if an interview can be put together. And that's actually what ultimately transpired. Thanks to those two gentlemen, I ultimately was able to get an interview, and I guess I did well enough at that ultimately I was hired into an investigator role in their what's called BSA AML department. So BSA Bank Secrecy Act that has to do with money laundering, and AML is anti-money laundering. So that's, everything having to do with suspicious transactions to, you may have heard about in the news, sanctions against different countries or against terrorist groups. Well, it's the BSA AML department that monitors transactions that may violate sanctions of the federal government. There's different watch lists that are maintained by the federal government for terrorists, not wanting to have transactions that are financing terrorist activity. So all that was under that department, and I went into an investigator role there for a couple of years, getting my start in the private sector in financial crimes in banking.
And then that led into another private sector position at Protective that led into another one that you're currently at with BlueCross, BlueShield. What was the biggest difference from being federal NCIS to now investigating in the private sector, kind of in the background?
Yeah, so I've played in both sides of that fence, right? So banks and financial institutions monitor transactions for potential criminal, terrorist, money laundering activity, and then if they identify that, there's a litany of different steps that they can take, but one that's required by law is they have to file what's called a SAR, Suspicious Activity Report, and that's a report that goes to the federal government. It goes to an agency called FinCEN, which is the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And then it gets divvied out to law enforcement and prosecutors, and they kind of, review them and determine, okay, this particular type of crime, this falls under the bucket of what FBI looks at. This goes under the bucket of what IRS looks at. This involves a Navy person, so NCIS looks at that. When I was with NCIS, I had worked several cases derived from SARs, from banks and financial institutions. I actually had one case one time where a father and son-in-law, and the son-in-law was active duty Navy, and he was trying to get into nuclear school, which is required to operate nuclear submarines. They came up with this scheme where they were trying to steal almost $1 billion from Royal Bank of Canada. They had this wire fraud scheme involving Swift messaging, which is how banks talk to each other for wire payments. Okay. And they came up with this script that the bank actually bought and sent $925 million to 3 banks. But fortunately, their corporate security department, after the funds had been sent to these 3 banks in other countries, realized, wait a minute, this looks suspicious. We probably shouldn't have sent this out. And they were able to call it back. So I had work cases deriving from SARs. But then I found myself on the other side of the fence where I was doing the initial investigation of transactions and then generating a SAR. So it definitely had some similarities, but the biggest, most obvious differences are in the private sector, you're not putting the handcuffs on people. You're not making the arrest. You're providing that information to your consumer, which is law enforcement, who then, not in every case, but in cases where, they pursue it, it can ultimately end up in that enforcement route.
It's incredible that today you're doing 2 different roles that have, the perception is they don't have much to do with traditional criminal justice tracks, because you are doing the background investigating in private sector, as well as you're teaching still. Did you ever think you'd be using your criminal justice degree in this manner?
As a student, while in the program, no. As a matter of fact, when I first started working in law enforcement, fraud and financial crimes was nothing I had any interest in. It kind of had the stigma of that's where the older investigators go when they're done wanting to do the stuff that's adrenaline inducing and fun, right? And then when I got with NCIS, my first 2 years, I was assigned to Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek, where I literally worked any felony crime that occurred, whether that was a theft, whether that was a sex assault, a death or homicide, drugs, anything that happened within either on that base or in and around that base that affected the base's operations. I did that for 2 years, and that was really enjoyable. Great squad of agents to work with. I was also co-located with the cold case homicide unit, which was at that same office. So got involved in some of their cases and surveillance and things like that. And then we also had our child sex crimes unit there. That type of work is both really, really difficult and really rewarding. It's really difficult because of, you're dealing with the most innocent of innocent victims, right? Children. But it's rewarding because you're also putting away people that are going after the most innocent of victims. But it takes its toll on you. And it's not a type of work that you can do for most people for many years. It takes a toll on your soul. So I got to a point where my wife and I, we were starting to want to start a family. And I had heard through the grapevine that fraud at NCIS, which the fraud office in Norfolk was just up the street from the base I was working at, that was a great opportunity for someone that either had young kids or was family oriented, because as my boss at the fraud unit used to tell us, there are no fraud emergencies. You're not getting called out at 3 o'clock in the morning because a fraud happened. So I made that transition initially just thinking I'll do this for a couple of years until my kid's old enough to be in school, and then I'll get back to the fun stuff. Two things happened. One, I never got back to what I thought was the fun stuff. And two, I found that I had a knack for this that worked out pretty well for a long-term career.
You opened the door several minutes ago with NCIS, the television show. I just have to ask, besides clerical and paperwork, what would people be most surprised about with the difference?
My wife and my father-in-law are huge fans of the TV show. And, one of the things they focus on in the TV show is personnel that do the crime lab work, the forensic scientist work. And what's funny is the real agency NCIS does not employ forensic scientists. They do have special agents that are trained in forensic science and are designated as forensic consultants. But as far as the crime lab, NCIS used to have one years ago, going back into the 90s. But what happened was the Army has a really sophisticated crime lab on the same level as the FBI's crime lab. It's called USACIL, which is the United States Army Criminal Investigative Lab. And USACIL is not just utilized by the Army, but by the entire Department of Defense. So NCIS sends their evidence there. Air Force OSI, they send their evidence there, as does the Army. So that's one thing. There's the character from the early seasons. She's got the dark hair and she kind of dresses in goth attire. There's not an employee like that at the real NCIS and hasn't been for decades. So that's one real sharp turn is for forensic science and lab examination of evidence that actually goes to the Army.
That's Ryan Schwoebel, an adjunct instructor at UAB and investigator for BlueCross BlueShield of Alabama. In 2004, Ryan earned his master's degree in criminal justice from the College of Arts and Sciences. Ryan is well-versed in the laws of education and enforcement and has a good idea of what it means to be a blazer.
One of the things I love about UAB is it's not off somewhere as a campus away from the city of Birmingham. It's right there in downtown Birmingham, on the southern part of downtown Birmingham. It's part of the culture of the city of Birmingham. I've worked in and around Birmingham in almost every job I've had except for NCIS. Being a blazer it means you're tied into the university, obviously, whether that's as a student, as a graduate, as a faculty member, as staff. But it also means that you're a deeper part of the culture of the city of Birmingham itself too. And I was born in St. Vincent's. I've been a Birminghamite, whatever the phrasing is there, literally all my life. And so to be a blazer, to me, a lot is kind of a way of coming full circle, if you will. Born in Birmingham at St. Vincent's, right up the road from UAB. Graduated from UAB with my master's. Went there for multiple classes during undergrad, and then ultimately finding my way back to UAB to be able to teach the next generations of students that want to go into criminal justice, I think is really cool. I think it's really cool to be able to have received so much benefit from UAB, from being a Blazer, and then have an opportunity, a really humbling one, to be able to come back and give back for all that I've received from UAB to the next generation that's looking to, go in their own career paths.
Be sure to check out past episodes of the UAB Green and Told podcast. Listen in at alumni.uab.edu/Green and Told. Have a story to share or know someone who does? Email greenandtold@uab.edu. Finally, be sure to follow us on social media. Just search UAB Alumni on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks for listening, and until next time, go Blazers.